There's a particular kind of silence that exists right before something irreversible happens. Not the quiet, I guess, of a library or a sleeping house. Something older, which heavier. The kind that presses against your eardrums and makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up one by one, like soldiers coming to attention. Most people who have felt that silence, truly felt it, never forget it. And most of them, if you asked, would tell you the same thing. They knew. Before it happened, they knew. Plus, Sarah Connolly knew. She just didn't leave fast enough, but that's just me. It was the kind of morning that fooled you. October in rural Virginia has a way of doing that. Draping gold over everything, making the broken things look beautiful, wrapping the world in a warmth that feels like a promise it's no intention of keeping. The trees along Route 11 were burning, orange and amber. The sky was the specific shade of blue that only exists for about 3 weeks a year. And Sarah Connolly, 31 years, old, mother of 2, was driving her beat-up Chevy Silverado down a road she had driven 1,000 times. Coffee going cold in the cup holder. Radio playing something she wasn't listening to. She was thinking about her kids. Daisy, 7, who had asked that morning why the leaves had to die to be pretty. Marcus, 9, who had eaten cereal standing up and then immediately left the spoon on the counter directly above the dishwasher, which was open, which was empty. She was thinking about that spoon, not about the man waiting for her at the rail yard. His name was Derek Foss, and Derek Foss had been making promises for 4 years that all sounded like love and acted like a slow leak in a tire. The kind you don't notice until you're stranded on the highway at 2 in the morning wondering how you didn't see it coming. He was Sarah's ex-husband in the way that a fire is your ex-tenant, technically gone, still living in the walls. The divorce had been final for 11 months. The restraining you? No. Order was 9 months old. Derek had violated it twice, both times with enough plausible deniability to slide through the legal system like water through a cracked dam. He showed up at the school once, said he just wanted to see the kids. He sent flowers to her workplace with a card that said, "I'm watching you grow." The detective Sarah spoke to said it wasn't enough. The detective said these things with the tired compassion of a man who had given the same speech to too many women who later became case files. Sarah had done everything right. Changed her route to work and installed cameras. Told her neighbor Linda, who was 72 and had survived a husband, a flood, and 2 rounds of chemo, and who kept a Louisville Slugger next to her front door without apology. She had done everything right. And still, that morning, she turned into the access road behind the old Shenandoah Valley Freight Terminal, a shortcut she used exactly once a month when Route 11 backed up, and that was the one morning Derek Foss was there. He was standing in the middle of the road. Not look in a threatening way. That was the, in my opinion, thing about Derek. He never looked threatening, not at first. Not from a distance. He was average-sized, pretty much clean-shaved, wearing a Carhartt jacket the color of dried leaves. He stood with his hands at his sides. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, the way a scarecrow stands at a field, and something about the stillness of him turned Sarah's stomach to ice water. She hit the brakes, which she should have reversed. She reached for her phone instead, and that 2-second hesitation, 2 seconds, the time it takes to blink twice, to exhale once, was all Derek Foss needed. He moved fast, and faster than someone who looked that calm had any right to move. He was at her door before she could lock it, wrenching it open with both hands, and the sound it made, that tearing, mechanical shriek, cut through the pretty October morning like a knife through a painting. What happened in the next 4 minutes, Sarah would later describe in a statement that took 3 hours to give, because she had to stop 7 times. Honestly, not from crying. Plus, from trying to find the words for things that don't have adequate words. Derek had zip ties. He had a chain. Actual chain, the industrial kind, the kind used for towing trucks. He had a padlock. He had, basically, spent time thinking about this. Planning it. Measuring distances and checking train schedules in the way that obsession, when it curdles into something truly dangerous, becomes methodical. He chained her to the railroad track. Left wrist, right wrist. The chain looped through the iron rail itself and locked. He didn't hurt her beyond that, didn't touch her face, didn't raise his voice. He crouched down in front of her when he was done and looked at her with an expression she couldn't name then and still couldn't name years later when therapists asked her to describe it. Look, not anger, not satisfaction, something more like grief, like he was already mourning something. He said, "I just needed you to stop running." Then he stood up, walked back to his truck, and drove away. And Sarah Connolly was alone, chained to a railroad track in rural Virginia, with her phone on the seat of her truck 8 feet away. Nowhere to run. And the sound, that specific sound, low and building, the kind that gets into your ribs before your brain even registers what it's coming from somewhere around the bend. A train. Not close. Not yet. But the tracks, were vibrating. She could feel it in her wrists, in her teeth, in the bones of her knees where they pressed against the gravel between the rails. She could feel it the way you feel thunder before you hear it, in the body before the mind catches up. She started screaming. Not for Derek, not for anyone specific. Just look, the raw, elemental kind of screaming that the body produces when it's run out of other options, the kind that tears the throat and doesn't care, the kind that animals make in traps. She screamed and pulled and felt the zip ties cut into the skin of her wrists and tasted blood where she'd bitten her cheek. The honestly, vibration in the tracks was getting stronger, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her about Daisy asking why the leaves had to die to be pretty. She thought about Marcus and the spoon. The, specific, stupid, ordinary spoon that she had been mildly annoyed about 4 hours ago. The spoon she had left on the counter without putting it in the open, empty dishwasher directly below it. The spoon that now felt like the most important object she had ever encountered in her life. Because if she could just get back to that kitchen, if she could just get back, she would put that spoon away herself. She would never be annoyed about a spoon again. A sound. I guess, not the train. For what it's worth, different and closer. Boots on gravel. Moving fast. Actually, more than one pair. Plus, she couldn't see them at first. The access road curved, and the brush was thick on both sides, and the morning light was coming at a low angle that turned everything at the edges into silhouette. But then they were there, 3 men in civilian clothes, moving at a pace that didn't match civilian bodies. There's a way that certain people move that registers before you consciously identify it. Like watching a hawk compared to a pigeon. The physics are wrong in a specific, purposeful way. The first one reached her in seconds. He dropped to his knees beside her without a word and had a multi-tool out before she could form a sentence. He was working on the zip ties, not the chain. The right call, the fast call, the call that required understanding that zip ties could be cut and chain required a key. And he made it in under 2 seconds, which meant he had already assessed the situation before he even reached her. "What's your name?" he said, not looking up from the zip ties. His voice was flat and steady in the way that voices are when they've been trained to be. "Sarah. Fun fact. Sarah, I need you to stay still for 10 more seconds. Just my take." The second man was on the chain, doing something with the padlock that she couldn't see. The third had stepped back and was on a phone, speaking in clipped phrases she couldn't fully hear over the growing thunder in the rails. 30 seconds, the, third man said, to no one she could identify. Or maybe to all of them. The first man looked at her then. Dark eyes. Calm the way deep water is calm. Not still, just deep enough that the surface doesn't show what's moving below. "Sarah," he said, asterisk when I say go, you run. You run to the tree line. You don't stop. Asterisk, she nodded. She was shaking so hard her teeth were clicking together. The chain came loose. She didn't hear how. TBH, she didn't care how. Go. She ran. She hit the tree line and turned back without meaning to, some reflex she couldn't control, and she saw all 3 of them moving away from the track. Not running exactly, but covering ground at a rate that didn't look like what it was. The train came around the bend like a wall of sound, and metal, horn blaring, brakes screaming too late, and it hit that section of track where she had been chained 2 seconds after the last boot cleared the rail. 2 seconds, which she sat down in the leaves. The gold and amber leaves, the dying pretty ones, and she put her hand to her lap and looked at the cuts on her wrists. listened to the train thunder past, and thought with the slightly unhinged focus of someone whose adrenaline hasn't yet gotten the message that it's over. I never asked who they were. She would find out. You know, everyone would find out. But not yet. Not in this moment, which in this moment, Sarah Connolly sat in the October leaves in rural Virginia with her wrists bleeding and her heart slamming against her ribs, and the three strangers who had pulled her off a railroad track stood at the edge of the tree line and watched the train pass, and nobody said anything at all. Some moments don't need words. Some moments are just the body being alive in the particular way that feels different from all the other moments before it, brighter, louder in the chest, more real than anything. Because for a handful of seconds, it wasn't guaranteed. She was breathing, which that was everything. For now, for what it's worth, that was the whole world. The first responders arrived 11 minutes after the train passed. 11 minutes. Sarah would think about that number later, when she was sitting in a fluorescent-lit room of the sheriff's office, a foil blanket around her shoulders that crinkled every time she breathed, a cup of coffee going cold in. Her hands, the second cup of coffee going cold on her this particular morning, which struck her as funny in a way she couldn't explain to the deputy who asked if she was okay when she laughed. 11 minutes. The men, I guess, who had unchained her had been. They're in under 3. The deputy's name was Holt. He was young, mid-20s, with the specific kind of earnestness that either survives law enforcement or gets ground down to something flatter. He was still in the surviving phase. He sat across from Sarah with a legal pad and a pen, and the expression of a man who had been briefed on the basics and was now revising his understanding of the world. Can you describe, to be fair, the individuals who helped you? He said. 3 men, she said. In my opinion, asterisk civilian clothes. They moved like, asterisk she stopped. She didn't have the word. Honestly, fast, she said. They moved like fast was their natural speed. Did they identify themselves? Asterisk, no asterisk, did they say anything about who they were or where they came from? Asterisk, she thought about the man with dark eyes. To be fair, the flat, steady voice. Stay still for 10 more seconds. The multi-tool appearing before she could process his hands moving. Pretty much, no, she said. Asterisk, they just did it. And then the train came and they walked me to the tree line, and then asterisk, she pressed her palms flat on the table. And then they were gone. Deputy Holt wrote something on his legal pad. She could see, from across the table, that he had underlined something twice. The cuts on honestly, her wrists had been cleaned and bandaged by a paramedic who introduced himself and whose name she immediately lost. The zip ties had left marks that would take 3 weeks to fade completely, and that she would catch herself looking at sometimes for months afterward in a specific distracted way you look at a scar you've stopped consciously seeing. Derek Foss was arrested at 9:47 that morning. He was found at his sister's house in Staunton, 22 miles away, sitting at the kitchen table eating a bowl of cereal. He was arrested mid-bite, which was the detail that Sarah's neighbor Linda, when told the story, found most satisfying. Mid-bite, Linda said, with the quiet relish of a woman who had been on the right side of justice long enough to appreciate the small poetic moments. He was charged with kidnapping, unlawful restraint, attempted murder, and 3 violations of the existing protective order. His public defender would later argue that Derek had not intended for Sarah to be killed by the train, that he had checked the schedule, that the next train wasn't due for 40 minutes, that he had only wanted to scare her. The prosecutor would, respond that Derek Foss had chained a woman to a railroad track, driven away, and that the intentions of a man who does that were not her client's problem to adjudicate. The judge, set bail at $500,000. Derek didn't have it. Plus, he sat in the Rockingham County Correctional Facility, and Sarah Connolly slept for the first time in 4 years, without checking the locks twice. But the question that started as a murmur in the sheriff's office and grew into something the local news picked up, and then the regional affiliates, and then 3 days later, something with a national dateline. The question was not about Derek Foss. The question was, to be fair, who were the 3 men? Because the, dashcam footage from the freight terminal's perimeter camera, grainy, at an angle, shot at 7:23 in the morning, showed three figures moving at a pace at the station's morning anchor. A woman named Trish Kowalski, who had been in local news for 19 years and had the unflappable tone of someone who had read a lot of bad things calmly into a camera, described as remarkable. She said remarkable the way other people would say inexplicable, carefully with room, built in for revision. The footage showed the three figures arriving at the scene from the direction of the access road, from behind the freight terminal, not from the highway, meaning they had not pulled over from Route 11, meaning they had not responded to screaming they happened to hear while passing, meaning they had been already somewhere on that access road. The camera caught them for exactly 4 seconds before the angle cut off. 4 seconds. 3 to be fair, men moving like fast was their natural speed. The internet did what the internet does. Theories proliferated at the rate that theories always proliferate when footage is grainy and information is incomplete. There were local hunters, they were undercover law enforcement, they were private security, they were military, they were something else entirely that the government didn't want you to know about. The hunter theory died quickly. Hunters move through brush, not along gravel roads, and they don't carry multi-tools deployed in under 2 seconds. The undercover law enforcement theory lived longer, but couldn't explain why no agency had claimed the action. When you save someone's life in an official capacity, you file a report. You write it down. There were no reports, and Sarah, for her part, had one thing the internet didn't. She remembered the man's hands, not in a poetic sense, in a specific, physical sense, the way you remember something that happened close to your face in low light. His hands on the zip ties, which the way he held the multi-tool, not gripping it, exactly, more like the tool was an extension of something that was already there, already precise. The knuckle of his right index finger had a scar that ran horizontal, old, and pale, the kind of scar that isn't dramatic enough to be from something dramatic, and is therefore from something that happened so often it stopped registering as notable. She told Deputy, in my opinion, hold about the scar. She told the FBI agent who came 2 days later about the scar. She told the journalist from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, a woman named Carolyn Marsh who had the specific energy of someone who slept 4 hours a night and thought that was plenty about the scar. Carolyn Marsh was the one who found the thread. Not because of the scar, not directly. Because Carolyn Marsh was the kind of journalist who, when presented with a story that had a visible surface and an unclear bottom, went looking for the bottom. She made calls. She drove to the freight terminal herself and walked the access road in hiking boots, notepad in hand, measuring distances in footsteps the way she'd been doing since her first job in news at age 22. She talked to the freight terminal's manager, a man named Gus who wore the same expression about everything. Mild, accepting like the world was a series of things that happened, and you just noted them and moved on. Gus told her that the terminal had been used 3 weeks prior as a staging area for a training exercise. He said it without emphasis, the way people say things they don't understand the significance of. What kind of training exercise? Carolyn asked. I think Gus shrugged. Asterisk military type, which they had permission. Federal clearance, the whole thing. They were in and out in 2 days, didn't bother anybody. Asterisk, so yeah, do you remember what branch? Another shrug. Asterisk Navy, I think. Or Navy adjacent. Something like that. Asterisk Carolyn Marsh drove back to her office and sat in front of her computer for a long time. Navy adjacent. In Virginia. And actually a rural freight terminal. Men who moved sort of fast and didn't file reports and disappeared before the police arrived. She made one more call to a source she had cultivated over 6 years at the paper, a retired officer who wouldn't go on record about anything ever, and who she called anyway when she needed the shape of a thing, even if she couldn't have a name of it. He listened to her describe the footage. Honestly, the movement, the multi-tool, and the chain and padlock assessment done in under 2 seconds. The 30-second warning. There was a pause on the line, which what do they call it? He said, slowly, like he was choosing each word from a bin that had a weight limit. When you're in the water and you need to get out of restraint fast. Carolyn wrote something on her notepad. Combat swimmer training, he said. Asterisk, they practice that. Cutting through honestly, restraints and low visibility, under time pressure with whatever you've on hand. Asterisk another pause. Among other things, he hung up without saying goodbye, which was how he always hung up. Carolyn sat with kind of her notepad. Plus, on it she had written 2 words and underlined them. She would spend the next 72 hours trying to confirm what she already understood the shape of. The way you understand the shape of an animal in the dark before your eyes adjust enough to name it. She would reach out to the Naval Special Warfare Command's Public Affairs Office and receive a response that said neither yes nor no in the specific, practiced way that says both. She would, talk to 4 veterans, none of whom would go on record, all of whom said the same thing in different words. That sounds about right. She would eventually publish a story that was careful and sourced, and that didn't claim more than it could prove because Carolyn Marsh was that kind of journalist. But in the freight terminal's grainy 4 seconds of footage, frame by frame, she had found something. A patch on the shoulder of the 3rd man, the one on the phone, the one calling out 30 seconds, barely visible, almost swallowed by shadow, the kind of thing you would miss if you weren't looking. And if actually you were looking, if you had been doing this long enough and knew what to look for, a small eagle, an anchor, a trident, the shape of a thing in the dark. Sarah Connolly, when Carolyn showed her the still frame on a laptop screen in a coffee shop in Harrisonburg, looked at it for a long time without saying anything. She had Daisy with her. Daisy was 7 and was eating a chocolate chip muffin with both hands and asking why the table was sticky. Sarah's eyes stayed on the screen. Asterisk is that sort of asterisk she started. I can't confirm it, Carolyn said. Not on the record. Sarah nodded, which she looked at the pixelated shape on the 3rd man's shoulder. She looked at her daughter, who had chocolate on her nose, and was now asking why muffins didn't have sprinkles. She kind of looked back at the screen. Her wrists, under the sleeves of her flannel shirt, still had the yellow-green edge of fading bruise where the zip ties had been. They didn't have to stop, she said. Not to Carolyn. Actually, not really to anyone. Carolyn didn't answer, because there wasn't an answer, or because the answer was obvious, or because some sentences don't need a response. They just need to be said into the air, witnessed, allowed to sit in the space they make. Sarah closed the laptop screen. Tell me what you know, she said. Carolyn opened her notepad. Outside, the October sky had gone the particular gray that comes in the afternoon. The gold burned off, the day settling into something more honest. Daisy had finished her muffin and was now asking for a napkin in the tone of someone who expected results. Sarah handed her one without looking. The story was not over. And in a way, it was just beginning. The part of it that mattered, the part underneath the surface, the subterranean thing that had been running this whole time below the kidnapping and the chain and the train and the arrest and the footage. The thing underneath all of it was simpler and harder to say than any of the facts. 3 men had been somewhere else and chose not to be. 3 men had a window of 30 seconds and used it. 3 men, basically, had walked away after without signing their names to it. And Sarah Connolly, who had spent 4 years being told there was not enough, was learning what enough looked like. It looked like 10 seconds. It looked like a multi-tool in the dark. It looked like a voice that was flat and steady and said, "When I say go, you run." She had run. She was still running, in a way that surviving something means you carry it in your legs forever, means the body learns a new gear it didn't know it had. She was running toward whatever came next. Outside, the first leaves of November were beginning to fall. Here is what nobody tells you about being saved. In my opinion, it doesn't end. Plus, the saving doesn't end. Not because, the danger continues, though sometimes it does in smaller, quieter legal forms and depositions and continuances and motion hearings where a man in a suit argues on behalf of the man who chained you to a railroad track. And you sit in a wooden chair and listen and learn to keep your hand still in your lap. Not because the fear doesn't fade. It does slowly in the way that the body eventually, stubbornly returns to believing tomorrow is possible. It doesn't end because the question doesn't end. The one that lives under all the other questions. The one that wakes you at 3 a.m, not with the sound of the train, but with something quieter. Why did they stop? Here's the thing. Not who. Sarah had her answer to who, or near enough to one. Carolyn Marsh's article ran on a Thursday in late October and said, in the careful language of confirmed but not confirmed, that the 3 individuals who had responded to the incident were believed to be active or recently separated members of a Naval Special Warfare Unit stationed at a facility in Virginia Beach, conducting off-site field training in the Shenandoah Valley region. The For What It's Worth article named no names. It quoted 4 anonymous sources and 1 retired officer who said on record that the kind of situational assessment proved in the freight terminal footage was consistent with training standards that are, to put it plainly, the highest in the world. The article was read, shared, picked up by wire services, and eventually found its way onto the kind of websites that have comment sections where people argue about things they've strong opinions on and no direct knowledge of. Some people said the response time was exaggerated. Some people said the government was covering something up. Some people said Sarah Connolly should thank God and move on. Sarah Connolly was doing something more useful than moving on. She was paying attention, which there's a specific education that comes from surviving something preventable. Not from the surviving, from the preventable part. From understanding with the clarity that only arrives after the adrenaline clears and the paperwork begins. That the system designed to protect you operates on a timeline that's fundamentally incompatible with the timeline of a person in danger. Deputy Holt, 11 minutes, and the restraining order, 9 months of violation before anything meaningful happened. The detective who told her it wasn't enough, a good man, limited by the gap between what the law could do and what the situation required. The men with the multi-tool, under 3 minutes. Sarah was not a policy person. She had a sort of high school diploma and 2 years of community college toward a nursing degree she had put on hold when Marcus was born and never fully resumed. She was not a lobbyist or an activist or a person who showed up at town halls with prepared remarks. She was, well, a woman who drove a beat-up Chevy Silverado and whose kids left spoons on the counter, who had once, on an October morning, been chained to a railroad track and rescued by people who were not supposed to be there. She joined a survivors advocacy group in November. By December, she was facilitating 2 of the weekly meetings, not because anyone asked her to, but because the woman who usually ran them was sick, and Sarah showed up, and nobody else was stepping forward. So she stepped forward the way you step forward when the alternative is everyone standing still. By February, she was giving a 10-minute statement to a subcommittee in Richmond about response time gaps in rural protective order enforcement, reading from notes she had written by hand. At the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, her handwriting cramped and slightly sideways the way it always was when she was writing faster than she was thinking. The subcommittee was 7 people. Plus, 3 of them were on their phones. One, was asleep in a way that he probably thought was not obvious. The remaining 3 listened. One of them, pretty much a woman named Delegate Patricia Osei, who had been in the state legislature for 11 years and had the compact, efficient energy of someone who had stopped being impressed by things that were supposed to be impressive and had redirected that energy toward things that were actually useful. Listened with her full face. Not just her eyes, her whole face leaning slightly forward. After the session, Patricia Osei found Sarah in the hallway outside the hearing room and handed her a card. The 3-minute actually gap, Patricia said. She didn't say hello first. Asterisk the difference between your situation and what actually happens in 90% of similar cases in rural counties. That's the story. Pretty much not the rescue. The gap. Asterisk, she tapped the card in Sarah's hand. I'd like to talk about closing it. Sarah looked at the card. I'm not, a policy person, she said. You just were for 10 minutes, Patricia said. You were very good at it. Sarah put the card in her coat pocket. She called the number on it 3 days later from the parking lot of Marcus's school. Engine running, heat on, 5 minutes before the dismissal bell. The For What It's Worth conversation lasted 42 minutes, which meant she was late picking Marcus up, which meant he stood outside the school in his winter coat for 4 minutes, being agitated in the specific way he had inherited from her. Not angry, just deeply inconvenienced by things that were not his fault. He communicated this primarily through silence and a particular quality of how he buckled his seatbelt. Sorry, she said. It's fine, he said, which meant it was mostly fine, and he would need a snack to fully confirm it. She bought him a granola bar at the gas station, and he ate it, and the transaction of his feelings completed. He asked how her day was, and she thought about the 42 minutes in the parking lot, and about Patricia Osei saying the word gap like it was something you could build a bridge over if you had the right materials and the specific anger required to see the project through. Pretty good, she said. The men, when she finally met them, were not what the footage had suggested. Or rather, they TBH were exactly what the footage had suggested, which meant that what the footage had suggested was not what she had expected. 3 months after the freight terminal, in a coffee shop in Virginia Beach that Carolyn Marsh had arranged and then tactfully exited, Sarah sat across a table from two of them. Though to be fair, third was deployed somewhere she was not told. She didn't ask. Their names, in this telling, aren't the point. They had been given permission to meet her, a word she thought about later, permission, and what it implied about the structure of a life where you needed permission to sit across from the woman you had pulled off a railroad track. They were in civilian clothes. They actually looked like regular people in the way that something that's very carefully not showing itself looks regular. A flatness in the presentation, a lightness at the edges like looking at the ocean and knowing there's enormous depth, but the surface is the surface. The one with dark eyes, the one who had spoken to her, who had said stay still for 10 seconds, was named, or went by, Cal. He was 34, which surprised her. He looked both younger and older than 34, which was a contradiction she sat with. The second man, broader, with the specific kind of stillness that large objects in high wind have, the stillness of something that has decided not to move rather than something that cannot, went by Ritter. They ordered coffee. They were polite. They didn't treat her like a case file or a headline or a moment they had survived. They treated her like a woman sitting across a table, which was the correct approach and which took a specific practiced kind of discipline to maintain. She understood because she could feel the weight of the thing between them. What it was to have been on opposite sides of 30 seconds. She asked the question she had been carrying for 3 months. Why did you stop? Cal looked at his coffee cup, not avoiding the question, considering it. The difference was visible if you were watching for it. We heard you, he said, which that's not. She stopped, started again, and asterisk you were there for a training exercise. You could have called 911 and continued. Asterisk, yes, Ritter said. So why didn't you? Silence. Not an uncomfortable silence. More the kind that happens when the true answer is so obvious to the people who have it that they're taking a moment to translate it into language that will make sense to someone who doesn't live inside the same framework. Because we could get there in 3 minutes, Kel said, and 911 couldn't. He said simply, not like it was a heroic statement, not like it required underlining, like it was math, the only math that mattered in that particular problem. We could get there. Therefore, we went LOL. Sarah sat with that. There's a particular quality of answer that's entirely sufficient and also somehow leaves you fuller than before, not because it gives you more information, but because it gives you the right information in the right form. She had spent 3 months building a version of the story around what she imagined the motivation might be: duty, training instinct, accident of proximity, some combination. The answer was simpler and larger than all of those. We could get there. She thought about the detective who had said it's not enough. She thought about 9 months of restraining order. She thought about 11 minutes and 3 minutes and the 30-second gap between when the chain came loose and when the train came around the bend. She thought about Delegate Patricia Osei saying gap with the specific energy of someone who had decided gaps were closable. You know what? Well, I've been doing, she said. Not a question. Cal nodded once, which Carolyn Marsh's article had not been the only coverage. Asterisk, does it seem? Asterisk, she stopped. Reorganized. Asterisk, does it seem naive to you? Asterisk, Cal looked at her for a moment. Ritter turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table, a gesture that seemed habitual, like something the hands did while the brain worked. No, Cal said. It seems like what you do when you figure out where the gap is. He left the word there. The gap. She had heard it twice now from two completely different people in two completely different worlds, and the convergence of it felt like something. Like when, look, you're navigating somewhere unfamiliar and two different landmarks line up the same way, you know you're on the right road. Derek Foss was sentenced 8 months after the incident. 14 years. The prosecutor had wanted 18. His public defender had argued for 7. And the judge, a woman named Hartley, who had been on the bench in Rockingham County for 16 years, and who had the particular economy of language that develops in people who have heard too many words used badly, gave him 14 and looked at him when she said it in a way that had no performance in it whatsoever. Sarah was in the courtroom. She had not brought the kids. She had brought Linda, who wore a purple blazer and sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her chin slightly elevated, the way someone sits when they've been waiting a long time for a thing to be finished and are finally watching it finish. When the sentence was read, Linda didn't react visibly. She just nodded once, to no one, to the room, to whatever accounting system she maintained internally. In the parking lot after, Sarah asked her if she was okay. Right as rain, Linda said, which was an expression Sarah had never understood and had stopped asking about. They drove to a diner on Route 11. Sarah had a chicken sandwich and a coffee that she, this time, actually finished while it was still warm, which felt like evidence of something. Linda had pie, which they talked about Daisy's school project on ecosystems and Marcus's soccer and the weather and the cracked sidewalk in front of Linda's house that the county had been promising to fix since April. They talked about nothing that mattered and everything that did. Sarah drove home. The kids were at her mother's. The house was quiet, which she stood in the kitchen for a moment, coat still on, keys in her hand, and looked at the counter. There was a spoon on it, directly above the open, empty dishwasher. She picked it up and put it away. She stood there with her hand on the dishwasher door and the house quiet around her, and she thought about Cal's voice saying we could get there, and about the vibration of the tracks in her teeth, and about Daisy asking why leaves had to die to be pretty, and about 3 months of meetings and statements, and a subcommittee with 7 people, and one woman who leaned forward with her whole face. She thought about the gap. She closed the dishwasher. She took her coat off. The thing about gaps is that they only close if someone decides to stand in them. Not as a martyr, not as a symbol. Just as a body, as a person who was in the right place at the wrong time and survived it and said, okay, so now what? The question on the other side of surviving. The question that makes surviving mean something beyond the basic fact of continued breathing. Sarah Connolly was not a hero. She had not chosen any of this. Not the freight terminal, not the chain, not the 30 seconds. She had not chosen to be standing in the space where a story wanted to begin. But actually, she had chosen after, which she chose every morning she drove to the advocacy office. She chose every night she wrote testimony at the kitchen table. She chose every time she stood in front of people and said, here's the gap. Here's what falls through it. Here's what the other side of closing it looks like. Here's what 3 minutes means. Here's what 30 seconds means. Here's what we could get there means when you're the person chained to the track. She would speak to the full state legislature in March. The bill, the one about rural response time protocols and protective order enforcement, and the specific gap between what crisis situations require and what traditional emergency response could deliver in sparsely populated areas, would move forward slowly in the way that things in legislatures move, which is not the way that trains move, but is the way that tracks get built. Honestly, piece by piece, bolt by bolt. She wouldn't always win. She wouldn't always be heard by rooms that were paying attention. She would sit across from people who had already decided and people who hadn't decided yet and people who were on their phones, and she would say the same things in different words until the words found the right room. And sometimes late, after the kids were in bed, she would sit at the kitchen table and think about 2 seconds. The 2 seconds between her hand reaching for the phone and Derek's hand on her door. The 2 seconds she would rearrange if she could and could not. The 2 seconds, that were the whole pivot of it. She thought about them and she sat with the feeling, not regret, not exactly something more complicated that didn't have a clean name, and then she got up and went to bed. Daisy, now older by the length of this story, would eventually do her school project on the ecosystem of the eastern deciduous forest. She would include, in her poster, a section on why leaves change color, the science of it, the chlorophyll breaking down, the underlying pigments becoming visible only when the green is gone. She would show Sarah the poster at the kitchen table. So they were always colorful, Daisy said, explaining her own project to her mother with the patient energy of the newly knowledgeable. Asterisk the gold, and orange was always in there. You just couldn't see it until the other stuff broke down. Asterisk Sarah looked at her daughter's poster. Like, yeah, she said. Plus, something like that. Outside, it was October again. The leaves were doing what they did. And Sarah Connolly, who had been chained to a railroad track and cut loose by men who moved faster than trains, and who had spent a year since then learning where the gaps were and standing in them, was sitting at the kitchen table with her daughter in the ordinary, extraordinary Tuesday evening of her life. Like breathing, still running, still here.